Hello and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This editorial deals with the role of the governor in a state, and it is of the opinion that governors must work and function within their constitutional parameters and not as agents of the center. This strong observation is being made by the editorial because the role and functioning of governors in a few states has come into question of late, particularly in the states of West Bengal, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu. All these states are ruled by parties which are in opposition to the ruling party at the center, and since it is the center which appoints the governor, it is being said that the governors of these states are functioning as the agents of center and unnecessarily targeting the elected state governments, thereby undermining the key constitutional principle of federalism. See, in West Bengal, Governor Jagdeep Dhankar has often interfered with the functioning of the state government and has even picked up fights against the state's chief minister on Twitter. The chief minister of West Bengal has said that the governor is trying to treat the elected government as bonded labor and has been summoning senior government officials. And when they don't turn up to meet the governor is taking to Twitter targeting the state government. Also, the governor has picked up a fight with the assembly speaker and has withheld his assent to the Howrah Municipal Corporation Amendment Bill, which has led to delaying of elections to the civic body. He has also raised allegations of corruption in welfare schemes and questioned government claims about investments in the state, and is quite often seen to be favoring the opposition party at the state. Something similar has been noticed in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu as well. In Maharashtra, Governor Bhagat Singh Koshyari has stalled the election of the speaker and has even tried to interfere with regard to amendments being pushed for legislative rules, and has taken the view that the state assembly cannot decide its own rules, which has been found unacceptable to the ruling coalition government. In Tamil Nadu as well, Governor R.N. Ravi has withheld his assent to the TN Admission to Undergraduate Medical Degree Courses Bill, and as per the constitution, he is either required to send it to the president for approval or return it to the assembly for reconsideration or to grant his assent. But by indefinitely delaying his decision, the governor appears to be undermining the state legislature, and this has serious ramifications for center state relations and also undermines key constitutional principles. But however, this controversy surrounding the office of the governor is not new. This is an issue that has persisted since several decades because quite often it has been seen that governors tend to function as agents of center, which is a colonial legacy, and they tend to interfere with the functioning of the state government and the state assembly, especially when states are ruled by opposition parties. So, this issue is not just limited to the current ruling party at the center, but it has been seen even during the rule of previous central governments, and hence the editorial takes a stand that governors must function within constitutional parameters and not as the agents of center. So, since this topic raises key constitutional issues, let us examine the topic in complete detail. See, as the role of the governor in West Bengal, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu has come into question, it is important to note that such conduct by state governors has been noted in the past as well, and this often amounts to unwarranted interference of the center in the affairs of elected state governments and state assemblies. As I mentioned, these states are often ruled by political parties which are in opposition to the ruling party at the center, and this gives rise to a negative image that state governors are being misused by the center as an agent to deliberately interfere in the functioning of the government and the assembly in order to undermine elected governments, which in turn undermines and subverts democratic processes and compromises a basic structure of the constitution, which is the principle of federalism. See, at the state level, the governor acts as a nominal head of the executive, just like the president at the center, whereas the real powers of the executive are exercised by the Council of Ministers, which is headed by the state's chief minister. It's also important to note that the Council of Ministers, headed by the CM, is collectively accountable to the lower house of the state legislature and not directly to the governor. The Constitution also mandates that the governor has to act according to the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, headed by the CM, and this clearly establishes that the role and position of the governor is largely ceremonial and nominal for fulfilling few constitutional requirements. But however, the Constitution does accord discretionary powers to the governor under extraordinary situations, and quite often it is these discretionary powers which are misused by governors. Constitutional experts have pointed out that governors tend to misuse their discretionary powers, especially in three circumstances. One, when they have to recommend to the president for proclaiming state emergency or president's rule. Then two, while appointing the chief minister in case of a hung state legislature when there is no clear-cut majority for any party. And three, while deciding the fate of the CM and the state government when there are intra-party defections. In these extraordinary situations, governors enjoy few discretionary powers, and how they exercise these powers and the manner in which they have exercised these powers has often led to controversies. So before we look into these controversies, first let's examine the role and functions of the governor as per the Constitution. As we stated, the governor is the constitutional head of the state. He is a nominal head, and all the executive actions in the state are taken in his name. As per the Constitution, it is the governor who appoints the chief minister, and later on the advice of the CM, he appoints the Council of Ministers. Under general conditions, the governor is responsible for ensuring the smooth functioning of the state administration, and it is also the governor's duty to ensure that state's administration is carried out in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution. If the governor determines that the constitutional machinery of the state has broken down, or if the administration of the state cannot be carried out in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution, then the governor can recommend to the union government, that is essentially to the president, to proclaim state emergency as per the provisions of Article 356. In these circumstances, the governor can send in a report to the president advising the imposition of president's rule in the state, and later if the president is satisfied that necessary conditions have arisen under Article 356, then the president will act according to the aid and advice of the Union Council of Ministers, that is the central government, and proclaims the imposition of president's rule. Once president's rule is proclaimed, the state administration comes under the control of the center, and the governor will start functioning as the center's agent. In these circumstances, the state's Council of Ministers can even be dismissed, and the elected assembly can be dissolved or even suspended. So these are clearly extraordinary and emergency powers granted by the Constitution to deal with extraordinary situations. But when the chief minister of a state enjoys complete confidence of the majority in the state legislature, then the governor's discretionary powers are largely curbed and restricted. When the state government has full majority, then the CM is the real head of the state administration, and the governor is just a nominal constitutional head. But by looking at these provisions, one thing becomes very clear. The governor has been mandated to play a dual role by the Constitution, wherein, on one hand, he functions as a nominal constitutional head, and his actions are strictly bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the CM. But at the same time, he also serves as the agent of the center, which is a legacy inherited from the colonial era. The British government in India started appointing governors to provinces who could function as the agents of the center in order to ensure that the center exercised complete authority and could interfere whenever needed in the political and administrative affairs of the provinces. This colonial legacy has continued post-independence as well, so this allows the governor to play a dual role. Under normal circumstances, the governor is just a nominal constitutional head acting as per the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. But under few extraordinary circumstances, the governor gains discretionary powers, which allows him to function as the agent of the center. So essentially, the political and constitutional conditions in the state directly influences the relationship between the governor and the chief minister. So while the governor functions as a nominal ceremonial head, he or she also functions as the eyes and ears of the center on the other hand, as the appointment of the governor, removal and transfers are completely controlled by the center. In this regard, the office of the governor doesn't enjoy autonomy, and the governor happens to be subservient to the will of the center. This is often misused by the ruling party at the center to meddle with the political affairs of state governments, especially those states which are ruled by opposition parties. And this is an unfortunate trend that we have seen from 1950s till date. Subsequent central governments have always interfered in state affairs by misusing the office of the governor and by misusing his discretionary powers. See, the source of these discretionary powers can be traced back to Article 163 of the Constitution. This article states that governor should exercise his functions based on the aid and advice of the State Council of Ministers. But however, it allows the governor to exercise certain functions at his own discretion. So since it is the center which is appointing the governor, and since the center exercises powers with regard to removal and transfer of governors, it will allow the center to meddle in the affairs of the state in combination with Article 163. Now, this nature of intervention by the governor in state affairs is not just limited to the selection of the CM or with regard to the imposition of president's rule under Article 356. This unnecessary, unwarranted intervention has gone beyond this, and quite often governors misuse their powers to determine the timing for proving legislative majority on the floor of the House, and quite often they even demand excessive information from the state about day-to-day administration and even pass public comments on these issues, which eventually ends up undermining the authority of the elected government and the legislature. These powers are also misused with regard to certain bills which have been enacted by the state legislature. If the center feels that these bills are against its political interests, it will use the office of the governor to indefinitely delay the governor's assent or to reserve the bills by using the provisions of the Constitution for the president's consideration, thereby directly undermining the powers of the elected state legislature. Then we have also seen several instances where governors comment adversely on specific policies of state governments if these policies are seen to be against the interests of the center. So this constant interference of the governor in the administrative affairs of the state has ended up encroaching upon the powers of the legislature, which is the elected legislature, and as well as on the powers of the elected state government. Constitutional experts argue that this amounts to abusing the governor's authority, and it ends up damaging India's federal structure and the democratic process. See, to get more clarity on this issue, we need to look at the role of the governor as it was envisaged by our constitution makers, and we need to take clues from the debates that were held in the Constituent Assembly. These debates clearly show that the Constituent Assembly was completely in favor of establishing a responsible government at the states as much as at the center, with the states being given their own jurisdiction where the center could not interfere. This forms the very crux of center-state relations and the principle of federalism. So India's constitution makers were very clear that the interference of the center in the matters of state should be kept limited, because state governments and state legislatures are also responsible elected bodies. And hence, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had even pointed out that I have no doubt in my mind the discretionary power given to the governor is in no sense a negation of responsible government at the state. It is not a general clause giving the governor power to disregard the advice of his ministers in any matter in which he finds he ought to disregard. The constitution that has been adopted makes it very clear that states were indeed sovereign within their own domain and their own jurisdiction, and the discretionary powers granted under Article 163 is limited to certain specific situations and extraordinary conditions. It does not enable the governor to constantly interfere in the functioning of the state government and the state legislature. So, on the question of selecting the chief minister, with regard to defections, in situations where there is a hung legislature and in interfering in the matters of state administration, the governor should not be exercising a discretionary role just to fulfill the wishes of the center. Because that is not what the constitution makers envisaged when the office of the governor was created. In fact, the same position has been taken by various committees that have been appointed on center state relations. Over the decades, several commissions have been set up to review center state relations, and they have all examined the role and functions of the governor. We have the Administrative Reforms Commission of 1968, the Raja Mannar Committee of 1969, the Committee of Governors of 1971, the Sarkaria Commission on Center State Relations of 1988, the Punchi Commission of 2007, which also looked at center state relations, and even the second ARC. They have all made similar observations about the role of the governor, and they have clearly pointed out that the governor should not function merely as an agent of the center. All these committees have pointed out that the governor's role is quite limited, and the constitution has granted the governor discretionary powers only to deal with exceptional situations. And even these discretionary powers will have to be exercised by the governor in the best interest of the state. It cannot be exercised to fulfill the wishes of the center. If the governor and the center are doing this, then it clearly marks an abuse or misuse of the governor's office, which undermines our constitutional provisions, including principles of basic structure like federalism. In fact, even the Supreme Court of India has taken a similar stand in this regard. If you look at the landmark S.R. Bommai case of 1994, it's very clear that the Supreme Court also took a stand against the abuse and misuse of the office of the governor in targeting state governments in an unconstitutional manner. But despite all these recommendations and observations, not much has changed with regard to the functioning of the governor, and on several instances, governors of different states, they continue to act as agents of center, and this directly affects the federal autonomy which has been granted to states under the constitution, and it also compromises several key constitutional principles. Now let's look at this column from page number 7, in which the writer examines the higher public capital expenditure that has been allocated in this year's union budget. The writer praises the central government and the union finance minister for providing a significant increase to capital expenditure, because this thrust on capital expenditure will help in creating crucial infrastructure, which in turn will directly contribute to the creation of numerous job opportunities and as well as aid the promotion of growth in the Indian economy. See, the writer is of the opinion that for India to achieve its true economic potential, first it will have to create sufficient gainful jobs for the unemployed youth. Because high levels of persistent unemployment in the country is a major source of concern, and this is clearly brought out by data from the International Labour Organization. As per ILO's data, India's employment to population ratio has declined significantly over the last 15 years. In 2005, India's employment to population ratio was at 55%. This has declined to 43% as of 2020. So this shows the rising trend of unemployment, because compared to India, other peer countries like China, Bangladesh and Vietnam, they have a much healthier employment to population ratio, and they even have a higher percentage of women in their workforce. Whereas in India, this is another major concern, because women constitute just around 20% of India's workforce. So this points to the gender disparity in India's employment and also highlights the increasing risk of unemployment. The data also shows that around 1 crore jobs have been lost in the country between 2016 and 2021, that is, between demonetization and the pandemic. So, this rising loss of jobs and increasing unemployment is a clear sign of structural issues in the Indian economy, which affects India's long term growth prospects. So, in this regard, the writer is of the opinion that job creation is of utmost priority for India to realize its true economic potential. And thankfully, the Union Budget, presented a couple of days ago, takes a right step by providing for a significant increase in public expenditure. This increase in public capital expenditure will drive infrastructure creation, which will end up creating numerous jobs and boosting growth in the long term. The writer praises the government for coming out with a transparent budget and also for realizing record tax revenue collection. If you remember, we spoke about this yesterday. I had pointed out yesterday that as per the data from Controller General of Accounts, India has registered a record tax revenue collection which has stood at 17.3 lakh crore rupees, which is just short of the budget estimate of 17.9 lakh crore rupees. There are several factors which have contributed to this significant increase in tax revenue collection. First, the government should be given credit for realizing higher income through GST collection, and credit also goes to the robust performance of India's organized sector. The increasing formalization of the Indian economy has contributed to increasing tax revenue and receipts for the government. And also in the previous budget, the government was more transparent and adopted very conservative projections on estimated tax revenue. It also transparently brought out the hidden off-balance sheet in the account books of Food Corporation of India, which clearly enhanced the credibility of the government and the budget. So in the coming financial year, tax revenue collection is expected to increase further, and this increased tax revenue gives the government enough scope to increase its expenditure as well. This increase in tax revenue collection has even offset the concerns about the shortfall in government revenue through disinvestment. But however, the high levels of fiscal deficit remains a concern because fiscal deficit has stood at 6.9% and the government is planning to bring this down to around 6.4%. But despite the high fiscal deficit, the government has gone in for higher allocation for public capital expenditure and has provided for a very substantial increase. This, according to the writer, is the most significant aspect of the union budget because the capital expenditure has been increased by 35.4% as compared to the estimates of last year. Last year, the initial estimate was an allocation of 5.54 lakh crore rupees. Later, it was revised to around 6 lakh crore rupees. But in this year's budget, the allocation for capital expenditure has seen a big increase to 7.5 lakh crore rupees. And as a result, it marks an increase of 35.4% as compared to initial estimates and an increase of 24% as compared to revised estimates of the last budget. This takes up the capital expenditure outlay for 22-23 to 2.9% of the GDP, and the effective capital expenditure of the center will come close to around 4.1% of the GDP. These figures are very crucial because this has also increased the capital expenditure average as a percentage of total government expenditure. See, between 2011 and 2021, the government's average expenditure on capital creation was just around 12% of the total expenditure of the government. Now, with this significant increase in capital expenditure allocation, the average has gone up to 16%, and the government is looking to take this up to 19% of the total government expenditure by 2023. So, this strong commitment of the center to provide for higher allocation for capital creation will serve as a major boost for creating hard infrastructure under the ambitious PM Gati Shakti program. It will drive the much needed public investments for funding the construction of crucial infrastructure projects such as roadways, railways, freight corridors, key power projects, airports and seaports, renewable energy initiatives, and even initiatives like production linked incentives or PLI schemes. All of this will scale up the quality of infrastructure in the country and will directly help industrial manufacturing, which will also help in driving more private investments into the sector, thereby helping in creating millions of jobs, which is absolutely essential for promoting and sustaining growth in the long term. But however, there are a few risk factors and conditions that exist to this policy because the success of this policy clearly lies in its execution. It all depends on how well the center, states, and local administration can execute these infrastructure projects and how efficiently they can complete these infrastructure projects in a time bound manner. Then it is also important to note that this entire capital expenditure allocation is not meant entirely for fresh greenfield investments and fresh greenfield projects. Part of this allocation is also being used to clean up the bad books of several government companies like Air India, BSNL, National Highways Authority of India, etc. But despite this, sufficient funds will still be left for aiding capital creation, which could genuinely help in creating world class infrastructure in India. But there are a couple of major concerns. Even though the government has increased capital expenditure allocation, it has cut down on social welfare and has not provided for any substantial increase in the allocation for key social sectors like education, healthcare, nutrition, rural development, etc. In fact, even these sectors of social welfare are equally important for promoting and sustaining growth, and they should have been given the same priority as being given to infrastructure creation. Then there is also the concern that increased allocation for public capital expenditure will increase the total expenditure of the government, thereby further raising the risk of even higher fiscal deficit. See, India's fiscal deficit is already in a dangerous category. Anything above 6% is extremely dangerous for macroeconomic stability. As of now, things appear to be under control. But if fiscal deficit increases any further due to increased government expenditure on capital creation, then it will end up putting pressure on interest rates and as well as on the monetary policy of RBI and will also increase the risk of inflation and could even result in higher current account deficits, thus creating a broader threat to the financial stability and the macroeconomic stability of the economy. But if these risks and concerns are well handled by the government, and if the push being given for infrastructure creation under PM Gati Shakti through higher capital allocation, if it is executed effectively and efficiently by the governments, then it will definitely translate to long term growth opportunities, which will help in creating much needed jobs for India's unemployed youth. Now let's look at this article from page number 1, according to which the government has informed the parliament that it is in the process of amending the criminal laws. See, most of India's criminal laws are outdated, and many of them, including the Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code or the CRPC, they all date back to the colonial era. So there have been several recommendations in the past from the Law Commission and as well as from the Administrative Reforms Commission to review, update, and amend the criminal laws. And accordingly, the government has stated that it is in the process of amending these crucial criminal laws in order to reform India's criminal justice system. Then, during this debate in the parliament, the government has also shed some light on the controversial issue of marital rape. See, under India's current legal system, marital rape is not recognized as a crime, and if a husband were to have forceful sex with his wife without her consent, it won't be treated as marital rape and it won't be treated as a criminal offense. This exception to marital rape has been provided under Section 375 of the Indian Penal Code. But the critics of this law have argued that not recognizing marital rape as a criminal offense amounts to condoning or overlooking domestic abuse, domestic violence, which could extend to the act of rape being committed within the institution of marriage. So, a batch of petitions have been filed at the Delhi High Court seeking the striking down of this exception so that marital rape could be criminalized in order to deliver justice to the victims of marital rape. But however, there is a counter argument to this, according to which marital rape is very difficult to establish in a court of law, primarily due to the lack of evidence, and such a provision could be easily misused, which could then end up threatening the very institution of marriage. In this regard, the 172nd report of the Law Commission of India had stated that it was not satisfied that marital rape exception should be recommended for deletion, since that could amount to excessive interference with marital relationship. This issue was even looked into by the J.S. Verma Committee, which was constituted in 2013 following the Nirbhaya gang rape case. The J.S. Verma Committee took a different stand and recommended that marital rape should be treated as a criminal offense and a suitable law should be introduced to deal with this. But the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which was passed in 2013 after the Nirbhaya gang rape case, which was based on the recommendations of the Justice J.S. Verma Committee, did not include this provision. Because this recommendation of the J.S. Verma Committee was forwarded to the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Home Affairs, and this committee agreed with the opinion of the Law Commission of India that recognizing marital rape as a criminal offense could be problematic and highly prone to misuse, which could threaten the institution of marriage. The same stand has been taken by subsequent governments, but this stand of the government and the parliament has been challenged by several petitioners at the court, and they are seeking required changes in the Indian Penal Code, as the government has started the process of reviewing and amending India's criminal laws. Now, coming to the last article for the day, let's look at this article from page number 8. According to the article, the budgetary allocation for children has fallen to a 11-year low, and the allocation for child health has decreased by a massive 6.08%. The total budgetary allocation for children in the union budget for the coming financial year is around 92,736 crore rupees, as compared to last year's allocation of around 85,000 crore rupees. Even though it appears to be an increase in allocation of 8.19% in absolute terms, it does not represent a proportionate increase in the total expenditure in the budget, and hence in real terms, after accounting for inflation, this nominal hike in budgetary allocation represents a fall in the allocation, and hence it is being considered as a concern for the welfare of children. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: governors must work within constitutional parameters, not as agents of the center. Critically evaluate. The second question: the thrust on capital expenditure in the union budget will help drive growth and create jobs, but it comes with some caveats and risks. Examine. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.